Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this American Journal web exclusive. I'm your host, Harrison Smith. We have a very important conversation for you today with our caller, Simon, about Sri Lanka and the catastrophe unfolding there, as well as in Pakistan. And this is about the absolute collapse of the food supply chain and major warning bells that we need to be paying attention to here in the West. Very, very informative conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. This web exclusive is brought to you by InfoWarsStore.com.
Watch the American Journal weekday mornings, 8 to 11 Central at band.video.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this American Journal web exclusive. I'm your host, Harrison Smith. This is a follow-up to a series of web exclusives we did previously with one of our favorite callers, Simon. And he's called in again to fill us in on what the latest is on some of the goings-on, mainly in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, as well as the South Pacific, locations that might not get a lot of play in the mainstream media, and yet what's going on there is extremely troubling, not just for them, but for us in the West as well. And it can also be seen as an example of what we may come to expect here in the West if the continual global collapse continues unabated. So with that, I'd like to welcome back to the show once again, Simon. Thank you so much for calling in, Simon.
Thank you very much, Harrison, for welcoming me back. It's a pleasure to be able to address the InfoWars audience. It has been a few weeks since we were last able to look at the situation in Sri Lanka, which unfortunately has become increasingly severe. There's the general problem of bureaucratic incompetence, which I am certain that is a malaise that affects every InfoWars listener as they deal with their own local government in America, but specifically in Sri Lanka. The government now for weeks and weeks has been promising that the agricultural sector of the country, which actually accounts for 80% of the employment, to put it in perspective,
wow,
that fertilizer, in particular urea, which is used once, twice, or three times during the production of rice, depending upon the specific type of fertilizer that's utilized, would be made available to the farmers who have all been given government instructions that they must go ahead with the preparation of the rice fields. And yet, just within the last few days, the government has said, oh, well, sorry, the fertilizer hasn't arrived. We appreciate it that you needed it several weeks ago, but hopefully 65,000 metric tons will arrive on July the 6th. The problem is the country needs approximately 400,000 tons.
Oh my gosh.
Not only is it very late, and any farmer or gardener will tell you that the amount of the correct fertilizer is not only important, but the time of the application, whether it's in the wet season or whether it's when temperatures are cool during the daytime, is all very well saying, well, sorry, it's 6 weeks late, but it's here now. That often is going to result in very, very poor crop yields.
Right.
So that problem has really not been properly addressed. And because the country, as we discussed before, is so incredibly short of foreign currency that they can spend on importing fuel, they're now finding that the country has essentially ground to a halt. So the schools were closed this week, which is not during their regular vacation time. And they were told to go to online learning, which fortunately they had plenty of practice at during COVID shutdowns. Just goes to show how what was done during COVID can be done for climate, or it can be done for economic emergencies. So that's worth bearing in mind.
Right. It was preparing everybody for this type of eventuality. I don't want to cut you off, but before we started recording, you told me some things about Sri Lanka that I think it's important for our audience to know, especially if they're like me. Sri Lanka, I don't have a lot of, I don't know a lot about Sri Lanka, to be honest with you, and I feel like a lot of Americans probably feel that way. Sri Lanka is not a place that has sort of generational issues where for decades they've been in turmoil and have been unable to feed themselves and this sort of stuff. You're telling me that as early as 5 years ago, they were actually completely food efficient and had perhaps the best form of food production, at least in their section of the globe. So I think that's important to lay the groundwork so people know that what's happening now is not something that has continually happened for a long time. It's pretty unprecedented. Could we lay that groundwork about Sri Lanka's success previous to the current disaster?
Certainly. So as recently as 2017, the country was rated as the most food self-sufficient in Asia.
Right.
And only 2 years ago, it went from being what was considered by many agencies as a low-income country to a middle-income country. And even though it did have a long-running civil war between the first and second largest ethnic groups, which were basically the Sinhalese and the Tamils, who were predominantly in the north of the country, that had been successfully resolved, and tourism was doing very well, agriculture was doing very well. And it just goes to show how it doesn't have to be a country that has a long history of civil strife and mismanagement, such as Somalia or Ethiopia, that the United States obviously has been involved. If people remember the movie and the book Black Hawk Down, which covered true events like in Somalia. Sri Lanka's not that type of situation. That many people are multilingual. The schools are good. There's a great abundance of media, and a lot of it is in English, so it is possible for Americans and European people to read about daily events there in an understandable language, the local one being quite difficult to grasp. And so the point remains for Americans that it's not necessarily a slow demise.
Right.
It can be a fast and systemic collapse. And whilst it seems many thousands of miles away, affecting a relatively small population group, the key of it is actually a chemical called urea. And urea, which is essentially nitrogen-rich fertilizer, is also the chemical that is now causing a shortage in the United States of what is called DEF, which is diesel emissions fluid, which is essentially urea mixed with distilled water. Now, many people in America who aren't necessarily involved in logistics or in the trucking industry may not have noticed this, but there is actually a very, very severe shortage not only of this diesel emissions fluid across the United States, but there's also, in part because of sanctions on Russia, now a shortage of the additives that are added to diesel engine oil.
Right.
That for a normal long distance truck operator, they would have to change their engine oil like the average person does on their car, maybe say every 5,000 miles. They have to use their special diesel engine oil, because obviously they're mainly diesel engines as opposed to gasoline engines like on civilian cars.
Right.
And they have to change that every 10 weeks, so about 5 times a year. And if we run out of diesel engine oil for the logistics industry, which includes trains, because most trains are diesel electric, and they use similar types of oils, then it means that exactly what is happening in Sri Lanka, which means that crops, if they have even been successfully grown, can't get to the wholesalers and can't then be shipped on to the supermarkets, could potentially happen this fall in the United States. And it's all that same chemical. It's urea. And so whether it's being used as fertilizer or whether it's being used as a necessary product for transportation, it ends up causing the same problem, which is fantastically escalating food inflation and a general inability to even ship non-essential goods.
Right.
This is a very, very, very severe problem that unfortunately, even though InfoWars has mentioned it a little bit and Mike Adams with Natural News has been really trying to get this information out into the public domain, is little understood. And so we can see how both availability and prices of a particular item are really having a global impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is almost incredible that it's exactly the same product that you put in diesel fuel that you need to run those engines and that you actually need to grow the food. I mean, it's the same ingredient and it's a shortage entirely. And yeah, you can go from 5 years ago, completely self-sufficient, top food producer in its region by population, to here's the headline from earlier this week, France24.com. As global food crisis looms, Sri Lanka offers a cautionary tale. So that's how rapidly this collapse can take place. And America is by no means immune from this type of systemic collapses as you discuss it. And so, I mean, how bad are things getting in Sri Lanka, and is there any hope that they're going to get better?
Well, the article that you just referred to there from France Press, which was dated, I believe, the 21st of June,
Yep.
that interestingly looked not just at the impact upon the most food vulnerable, so the poorest segments of society, which ironically may actually be the best able to survive in a complete systemic collapse.
Right.
Because what we're seeing is that the farmers who were commercial farmers and were growing an abundance and selling the surplus on are now resorting to what is called subsistence farming. So they're only growing using historical techniques like medieval,
Right.
Wooden plow type techniques that don't require a machinery to be repaired or require diesel fuel or require electricity, right? If they're just producing enough for themselves to keep themselves alive, there's no extra to provide food for the sports stars and the lawyer and the accountants and the politicians and anybody who lives in a city.
Right.
So the bus drivers and the train drivers and stuff, they're all disconnected from the land. And so you can see how, ironically, those people may be the most at risk. And so France Press went to the country, and rather than focusing necessarily upon the plight of the rural farming community, they were looking at what the impact was upon the middle income society, which in that regard, albeit that it's smaller as a percentage of the population in Sri Lanka as opposed to the United States, actually, when you look at the impact that they're suffering, it makes you realize that a much greater percentage of the American population would be affected were similar circumstances to plausibly occur within the United States. It wouldn't be like a 10% middle class. It would be a 30 or 40% middle class that would be affected in the United States. And so they were interviewing even people like commercial bankers, not rich fat cat stockbroker Wall Street types, but people who would help you with your mortgage or with your overdraft or your checking account, right?
Right.
And these people were saying that because of the shortage of cooking gas and because of the food inflation that's currently running at 57%,
Ooh.
57% in Sri Lanka, right? And I'll make it once again another American comparison there that many people don't really understand in the United States. They were resorting to cooking their meals instead of using propane, which is an everyday fuel, not a luxury barbecue fuel. but what most Sri Lankans use to cook their meals. They were using what were essentially miniature clay pizza ovens
Right.
that they were fueling with sticks and cooking in their apartment courtyard or on the porch of their house. So imagine you go from being a middle income banker who maybe was making the equivalent of $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year, and you're now cooking with sticks on your front porch.
Right. Right. And this, as you pointed out, Sri Lanka is something like 80% rural. So as you mentioned, I mean, that's a far cry from the average American population. So, yeah, I'm glad that you put this in the American perspective because, I guess it's just an aspect of being American. We're a little bit self-important, we admit, and we go, well, Sri Lanka, they have to cook on pots. That's them. Well, it would actually be significantly worse for us should this catastrophe continue to roll out and affect us here. And I think that's really stark in the way that you put it. And of course, this article from France 24 illustrates exactly what you're saying like most urban Sri Lankan middle classes, the Rajawasams used cooking gas cylinders, kitchen essential that everyone took for granted, to prepare their meals. But that was before the South Island nation suffered its worst financial crisis since independence in 1948. They now say they've reverted to a pre-industrial age mode of cooking, placing a clay wood burning stove on a tiny cement slab outside their homes that now serves as their backyard meets kitchen in the suburb of Colombo, the Sri Lankan capital. So, yeah, as you point out, just a really devastating, civilizationally devastating blow to the ability of people to feed themselves. I mean, this is the most basic stuff we're talking about, and yet it seems to be spiraling out of control there. Really troubling stuff.
So, if I might, I'll cast this shadow over the European continent as well. So, because of the fertilizer issues that are affecting the entire world, the European Commission formed an emergency group called the European Food Security Crisis Management Group. Now, I appreciate that many listeners want summaries and they don't want to have to bother reading agendas and meetings and the minutes and releases and all this kind of stuff. And that's perfectly reasonable and normal. But in that case, they held a meeting, and I fortunately had the time to be able to read the minutes of it, where just like in Sri Lanka, these completely disconnected from reality bureaucrats were telling the representatives of the farming industry on the call, which lasted a whole day, that they should plant out more land, which is exactly what the government of Sri Lanka has told the tea plantation owners and the railway company that had disused land. But in the case of the railway company, some of that land was contaminated with industrial products that nobody bothered to clean for decades, right? But even in Europe, if the fields hadn't been fertilized for several years because they'd been set aside during years of abundance, they required a lot of preparation. So they said, okay, well, go ahead, start preparing the field for cultivation, exactly the same as the government has told all the farmers in Sri Lanka. Then the European farmers said, well, you realize that we're going to need fertilizer. And when we plow up the land, then we need fertilizer straight away before we even plant out. So they said, okay, well, go ahead and do that. But they said, no, you don't understand. The price of the fertilizer has gone up, like, depending on the brand and the specific scientific qualities, fourfold, fivefold, or sixfold since last year. And they're like, okay, well, maybe we can give you some subsidies and just buy it, and then we'll figure that out, is the bureaucrat response, which obviously is a completely idle promise that's not funded or congressionally approved at all.
Right.
Okay. Then they said, okay, but what about the seeds? Because we have to order the seeds like 6 months in advance, and you're telling us to do this like next week and plant in like 4 weeks' time, but we don't have any seeds. So they're like, well, there must be seeds available somewhere. So they said, yes, there are. We can get some seeds from America, which would obviously hugely drive up the price of crop seeds in America if suddenly all the farmers in Europe were trying to buy up seeds that
Right.
they should have ordered months ago. Okay, so that directly affects the American consumer with rising food prices. So they said, okay, well, go ahead and order all the American seeds. But then they said, well, you realize, of course, that the American potato, corn, and soybean seeds, they're all genetically modified and they're banned in Europe. So are you going to waive all the laws in Europe that prevent us from using American seeds, even assuming that we could buy them, and then they would have to be flown by airplane rather than ship because it would take too long for them to come by ship? So the bureaucrats had
Oh my gosh.
no answer to any of these legitimate questions. But if you read the minutes, you knew this is an absolute catastrophe. It is too little, too late, in the wrong place, with no overarching plan to respond to a food security crisis. But the press release that was issued the next day simply said, we've told the farmers to plant out more acreage, and didn't address any of the critical production issues that they had identified, including the cost of diesel being double what it was a year ago. None of those issues were addressed in the press release. So the entire European public, like the entire American public, thinks, oh, good, the government's handling this.
Right.
But in reality, stuff's not being put into the ground on time with the right fertilizer to ensure that we have something to eat at Christmas.
Right, and I can just see the headlines now blaming the farmers once that eventuality comes about, because people don't understand unless people like yourself explain it, that they're demanding that farmers use fertilizer that they don't have and can't afford, to plant fields that are fallow, using trucks that they can't afford to fuel, and seeds that they needed to buy 6 months ago and that are illegal in Europe. I mean, talk about a perfect storm of a catastrophe. It's really troubling. And I don't want to get too far off track because, again, I want to tie this back to Sri Lanka, and we still have Pakistan and a lot of stuff about South Pacific that I really think we need to get into. But is this connected to the Dutch protests? Because I know the Dutch farmers are protesting right now, 40,000 of them in the capital, protesting against the maneuvers of the Dutch government there in the Netherlands, essentially punishing farmers for using too much nitrogen. And I know that's sort of the key ingredient that the fertilizer provides for the growing of food. So again, without getting too far off track, are the Dutch farmer protests going on right now related to this?
Well, the Dutch farm protests are both about fertilizer, but also generally in line with the methane pledge,
right,
and the whole fake meat industry. The cattle and dairy farmers are being put under enormous regulatory pressure that essentially will do away with the production of meat in Holland, which is like the top producer, for example, of quality veal from calf meat. So that is part of the kind of overarching globalist, let's decimate agriculture. But in terms of going back to the seeds and what was happening in Europe, we've got exactly the same situation. So if you look at the France Press article, and also the article dated the 26th of June from the Sri Lanka morning newspaper, it's actually called The Morning, then they were saying that even not rice growers in Sri Lanka, but vegetable producers would normally be allocated high quality seed stock through a centralized government distribution program. And that has completely failed this season. And so the people who would be producing the vegetables that would be added to the rice to provide a balanced nutrition, 90% of those simply aren't planting out their vegetable fields because they haven't been given the seeds, because the government doesn't have the money to import them. So it's a huge trifecta of events. And then in the same article, they interviewed a radish farmer. And he explained that he had produced radishes and he had a reasonably successful crop because he had prepared his fields many months ago, and he had worked on it for months and months and months, and more importantly, borrowed money in order to do so. He couldn't get commercial transportation for his crop to the wholesaler center.
Wow.
So he had to go backwards and forwards on like a three-wheeled motorcycle.
Right, yeah.
Like car, like you see in Thailand, and they're very popular for urban transportation, like a taxi, like a mini taxi, three-wheeler taxi.
Sure.
So he was using that to take his tons of radishes to the wholesale center, right? Then he ran out after a few days of fuel for his three-wheeler motorbike, okay? He paid over the odds for a commercial driver to come and take the rest of his crop, and he waited and waited and waited to have this lorry driver arrive, like with like an 18-wheeler,
right,
to take the rest of his crop, and the guy never turned up, and so the radishes ended up rotting. So even where they were successful, because the distribution chain has broken down, that the food didn't get to the supermarkets. And now, this will give you an idea of how severe things are. The Sri Lankan government has not only told all of its civil servants, so like the federal employees, to stay at home for 2 weeks because the country's out of fuel, right? But they've also told them that for the next 3 months, they can take Fridays off. But what they want them to do on those Fridays is turn their residential gardens into vegetable plots, so that when we get to September, October, that all of these residential gardens can be used, like in America and Britain, they called them victory gardens.
The victory gardens, yeah.
Yes. So they've told the entire Sri Lankan civil service, you need to prepare. But if you've been given the day off on a Friday and you live in an apartment in the city, what gardening are you doing?
Right.
Right? It's only the top executives who have a big house with a garden that could even do that. And then you think the equivalent of the U.S. federal senior executive service, or the people in their 50s and 60s who are making $100,000, $200,000 a year, they're out digging up their vegetable beds during the weekends. I mean, and that's the government plan for avoiding famine in the winter.
Oh my gosh. And yeah, and hopefully that's not too little too late. I mean, it sounds like maybe it's time for America to start getting on our victory gardens before we have to be told by the government to do it. But I mean, it's just, obviously the old cliche, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And here you've got, whether it's the fertilizer or the seeds or the transportation itself, there are so many weak links in this that the chain seems to be continually failing. Oh my God, incredibly troubling stuff, and I can only hope that it's not a portent for our future here in the West. And clearly, we cannot be comfortable enough to just ignore this going on, knowing that all of these same effects are happening to us, maybe not at quite the degree they are yet at Sri Lanka, but there's no sign, as far as I can tell, that things are slowing down and that there's going to be any reversal anytime soon for us. Hopefully, Sri Lanka can make it through this. Now, when it comes to Pakistan, because we do have a few more things to cover here, how does that tie into everything else going on?
Well, once again, you've got some national situations in Pakistan, and you've got some other very close similarities to the United States. So many Americans will be aware in the west of the United States that you have two large reservoirs. You have Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Mm-hmm. And those two reservoirs supply drinking water basically for Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, mm-hmm. and also a lot of hydroelectric power.
Right.
So in Pakistan, they have an enormous reservoir called Tarbela, Tarbela, and that, just like Lake Powell and Lake Mead, is right on what they call the dead level, which is the level at which they can't drain any water either for irrigation or for hydroelectric power generation. And so, just like the west of the United States, they've got a very, very severe problem. Now, that reservoir there is generating approximately 20% of all of the electricity for the entire country. And a lot of the other electricity that's being generated is coming from coal and oil, which they were going to import from Russia. But when there was the US-backed change of government that occurred a couple of months ago, that put the kibosh on the plans to get the cheap fossil fuels from the Russian Federation, and instead they're having to buy them on the global market. And that, with the collapse of their currency, just like Sri Lanka, in local terms, has hugely put up the price of electricity, such that in the last year it has more than doubled. So whereas in Sri Lanka it's tripled, in Pakistan it's doubled. And then, because they're trying to negotiate a deal with the largely US-run International Monetary Fund, because they're once again very, very short of foreign reserves, they're finding that they've been forced to cancel all the fuel subsidies. And so their prices of gasoline and diesel have hugely gone up in Pakistan as well. And so to tie it back to the United States, I'd like to be able to explain, if I may, very briefly, the effect of the currency movements. So they, just for the summer planting season, repriced all of the agricultural fertilizers that are commercially available in Pakistan. And many of them went up 50% from 3 months ago.
3 months.
Okay. Yeah. And what had happened is, because the currency has essentially devalued over the last 12 months by over 35%. And so when people look at commodity prices having gone up 50% in US dollar terms, you then have to translate that into the local currency. So if the local currency at the same time has significantly depreciated against the US dollar, the actual impact upon the local people is not a 50% dollar increase, it's a 100% local currency increase.
Right.
Because it's going up in dollars, and then you have to times it not by 2, but times it by 3 for the local currency, because the local currency's gone from 2 to the US dollar to 3 to the US dollar. So it's a double whammy. And this, at the moment, is what the US consumer is not experiencing. And so for all the foodstuffs that we've been importing over the last 12 months, people think about the fiat currency being worthless and the value of the US dollar being destroyed. But over the last 12 months, that generally hasn't been true. Generally, both against the pound and the euro and the Japanese yen and many of these Asian and African and South American currencies, the US dollar has actually got stronger. And so that has reduced the inflationary impact of imported goods into the United States. And if that situation were to either stop or were to reverse, then the mirror image of what has happened to Pakistan and Sri Lanka would then apply to the United States. Not only would we have rising prices, but the US dollar would be worth less internationally, and then America would be hit by the double whammy.
Right.
And that is potentially what is coming. So that's, when people are unhappy, that American food inflation is running at 10 or 15%, that's with the benefit of a strong dollar. So imagine if that stops, that strong dollar stops.
Right, it's a multiplying effect almost.
And then it's not going to be 10 or 15%. You'll have what you have in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, where it's suddenly 50 or 60 or 70%. In Turkey at the moment, food inflation is running at 114% annualized. Okay? So then, Americans, well, I can buy a smaller product and I can buy a store brand and I can cut out having a cookie every day. Right? But then when you suddenly go to your staples, your cereal and your bread and your coffee doubling in price in a year, it's very hard to economize your way out of that.
Right. Oh my gosh. No, I mean, I don't want to overuse the term perfect storm, but my goodness, it really feels like the tornado alert is going off while the hurricane is hitting, and you start to feel the ground rumble. I mean, it seems like this really is just a catastrophe unfolding before our very eyes.
Watch the American Journal weekday mornings 8 to 11 Central at band.video.
Live from the Infowars.com studios, it's Alex Jones.
The silent majority
Is no longer
silent. This is The War Room with Owen Schroyer.
Please stand by for further details. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.